In the fading light of a sun that burned gold across the Arizona plains, a lone rider made his way back to the ranch. Dust rose behind his horse like a ghostly veil, curling into the air before sinking back into the dry earth. His name was Caleb Turner, a cowboy who'd known too many battles, too many losses, and too few moments of peace. The war between settlers and the Apache had left him hollow inside, his land scarred, his trust fractured. Yet somewhere beneath that weathered exterior, a quiet longing still lived, though he'd long stopped believing he'd ever find what it sought. That evening, the ranch was silent, except for the slow creak of the windmill and the restless neigh of the horses in the corral. Caleb dismounted, brushed the dust from his coat, and stepped into the wooden cabin that had become his only home. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the scent of cedar and old smoke. He hung his hat on the hook by the door, tossed his gloves on the table, and reached for the whiskey bottle that waited like a loyal friend. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that he wasn't alone. Behind the thick wooden doors of his wardrobe, crouched low among his neatly folded shirts and worn denim, an Apache woman hid in silence. Her name was Nayeli, though no one in this world knew it now. She had fled from her village 3 days earlier, her body bruised, her spirit broken, her people scattered after a brutal raid by soldiers. Alone and hunted, she had wandered through the desert, barefoot and desperate, until she stumbled upon the Turner ranch. The ranch had seemed deserted then. She had seen no man, heard no sound, and in her exhaustion, she had slipped inside through an open back door. She'd meant only to rest, to steal water, perhaps a crust of bread. But then she heard the hooves, the voice of a man returning, and fear gripped her heart like a vice. In a wild panic, she had darted into the only hiding place she could find, the large oak wardrobe in the corner of the room. Now, pressed against the rough wood, she listened to every creak of the floorboards, every breath he took. She could smell the faint mix of soap and saddle leather on his skin as he moved about the room. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared he might hear it. Caleb moved slowly, his body heavy with fatigue. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, stared into it for a long time, as if searching for something lost in the amber liquid, then began to unbutton his shirt. The wardrobe door had a small crack where the hinges didn't close flush, and through it, Nayeli could see him. The curve of his shoulders, the hard lines of his back marked by years of labor and battle. She didn't mean to look, but after the endless fear and loneliness of the desert, the sight of another human, alive, calm, unthreatening, held her transfixed. She watched him shed his dusty clothes, watched the way his muscles tensed and relaxed with each movement, the way he carried himself with both power and weariness. He wasn't like the soldiers who had brought fire to her people. There was no cruelty in his face, only a quiet, rugged sorrow. When he finally lay down on the bed and the room fell silent, except for the soft rhythm of his breathing, Nayeli exhaled the breath she'd been holding. For the first time in days, she didn't feel hunted. She didn't feel the sharp claws of fear digging into her chest. That night, she stayed hidden, her head resting against the wood, her mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? Would he kill her if he found her? Or would he, just maybe, spare her life? Morning came painted in orange and gold. The rooster crowed, and Caleb rose with the sun. Nayeli remained still, pressing herself deeper into the shadows as he dressed. Again she watched, though now not out of fear, but something she didn't yet understand. His every movement was slow, deliberate, shaped by habit and solitude. He spoke softly to his horse through the open window, his voice rough but kind. Each day was the same. He would leave early, work the land, mend fences, tend to his horses, and return in the evening with the same tired grace. And each night Nayeli would remain hidden, watching through that narrow crack as he undressed and slipped into bed. The rhythm of his life became the rhythm of her survival. But with every passing day her curiosity deepened. She learned the smallest things about him, the way he rubbed the scar on his left arm when lost in thought, the way he sometimes lingered by the window, as if looking for something beyond the horizon. She began to feel a strange pull inside her, one that frightened her almost as much as being discovered. 3 days turned into 4, then 5. She should have left long ago. She told herself she would. Each night she swore it would be the last. But something in that cabin, something in that man's quiet loneliness, kept her rooted there. Outside, the land was vast and merciless. Coyotes howled in the distance, and soldiers sometimes passed on patrol. Inside, she had safety, if only for a while, but she knew it couldn't last. No secret could. One evening, as a storm gathered over the plains, the wind began to howl through the cracks of the cabin. Rain battered the windows like pebbles thrown by the heavens themselves. Caleb came home soaked, his shirt clinging to his skin, his boots muddy. He built a fire, stripped off his wet clothes, and moved about the room in nothing but his undershirt. The firelight danced across his body, painting him in flickers of gold and shadow. Nayeli's breath caught in her throat. Then, without warning, the wardrobe door creaked. She froze. He turned for a long moment, neither moved. And in that instant, the fragile barrier between their two worlds, the world of the cowboy and the world of the hunted Apache woman, began to crack. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, another storm had just begun. The storm outside showed no mercy. Wind clawed at the roof, rain lashed against the window panes, and thunder rolled across the valley like the growl of an ancient beast. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled fiercely, its glow casting long, restless shadows along the walls. Caleb Turner stood motionless near the hearth, his chest rising and falling with the heavy rhythm of someone who'd spent too many nights alone on the frontier. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something else in that silence, something watching him. The faint creak that had turned his head came from the wardrobe in the corner, its door trembling slightly in the wind. At first he thought it was nothing more than the storm's doing. But then he saw it again, the smallest movement, a flicker of shadow behind the narrow crack of wood. His instincts sharpened, years of surviving raids and ambushes burning suddenly awake. He took a step forward. Inside the wardrobe, Nayeli held her breath so tightly her chest burned. Her heart thundered against her ribs, each beat echoing like a drum inside her skull. For days she had watched him without being seen, had lived in that narrow space like a ghost. But now, the storm had betrayed her. The door she'd thought secure had come loose with the wind's force. She pressed her body back into the darkness, her hands trembling, her mind racing for a plan that didn't exist. Caleb reached the wardrobe and placed his hand on the door. The hinges groaned softly beneath his touch. For a moment, he hesitated, as if his heart knew that what waited inside would change his life forever. Then he pulled it open. The light of the fire spilled in, washing over the woman crouched inside. Her skin, bronzed by the desert sun, glowed in the dim light. Her eyes, dark, wide, and fierce, met his with a mixture of terror and defiance. Her long hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her dress, once beautiful in its tribal patterns, was torn and dirty from the journey she had endured. Time seemed to stop. Caleb didn't speak. He only stared, confusion and shock mingling with something deeper, something unspoken, born from the loneliness that had shadowed him for so long. Nayeli stared back, frozen like a deer caught in the open, unsure whether to run or stay. Every muscle in her body was poised for escape, yet her exhaustion chained her to the spot. For a long while neither moved. The storm roared on outside, filling the silence between them with nature's fury. Then, slowly, Caleb lowered his hand. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't shout. He simply turned away and stepped back, his mind trying to grasp what he'd just found hiding within his own home. Nayeli remained motionless, watching his every move. She expected anger, violence, perhaps even death, but none came. The cowboy stood at the table, staring at the fire, his jaw tight, his thoughts hidden. Minutes passed. The air grew thick with tension and uncertainty. Finally, he moved to the shelf, took a blanket, and placed it on the chair near the fire. Without looking at her, he walked to his bed and sat down, the exhaustion of the day returning to his shoulders. Nayeli hesitated. unsure if it was a trap. But the warmth of the fire and the bitter cold of her soaked clothes left her little choice. Slowly she stepped out of the wardrobe, her bare feet touching the wooden floor, her movements hesitant and careful. The sound of rain softened as dawn began to creep toward the horizon. All through the night, she stayed near the fire, clutching the blanket around her like armor. Caleb didn't move from his bed, but sleep never came to him. He lay still, listening to her soft, cautious movements, the faint crackle of the fire, and the whisper of rain easing outside. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed and quiet. Mist clung to the fields outside, and sunlight filtered through the clouds like a hesitant blessing. When Caleb rose, Nayeli was awake. She stood by the window, watching the land stretch into forever. The air between them was thick with the weight of unspoken things. He didn't know who she was, but he could see she'd been through hell. Her wrists bore faint bruises, and her eyes held a kind of pain he'd seen before. In war, in loss. In himself, he left food on the table before stepping outside to the stables. The gesture was wordless, but spoke volumes. He didn't intend to harm her, nor drive her out. Not yet. She watched him through the window, puzzled by his restraint. The cowboy she had feared now seemed like an enigma, a man of silence, carrying his own ghosts. As the days passed, a strange rhythm began to take shape. She stayed in the cabin, too weak to leave, still wary of the unknown beyond the ranch. He returned each evening, always quiet, always distant. Yet his actions carried a quiet kindness. Extra food, a repaired chair, a folded coat left near the fire on cold nights. Nayeli, still haunted by the memories of her tribe's destruction, began to observe him again, not from hiding this time, but from the corners of the cabin. She saw the way he worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, how he cared for his horses with patience, and how he sat alone each night staring into the fire as though it were the only thing that still listened to him. There were moments when she caught him glancing her way just for a heartbeat, before turning back to his work. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them began to shift, no longer a wall of fear, but something fragile, uncertain, almost human. Yet, even as that fragile peace formed, the world outside remained dangerous. Riders had been seen near the ridge, soldiers searching for Apache survivors after the last raid. If they found her here, they would not spare either of them. Caleb knew it, and though he didn't fully understand why, he began to hide her more carefully, closing shutters, keeping the barn stocked so she could stay out of sight when strangers passed. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt since the days before the wars, the instinct to protect. Nayeli watched all of this in silence, her heart torn between gratitude and the fear of bringing ruin upon the only person who had shown her mercy. Each night, as the firelight danced on the walls, she wondered if she should slip away, vanish into the desert before her presence destroyed him. But each morning, when she saw the distant figure of the cowboy riding across the horizon, she found herself unable to leave. The land was vast, cruel, and empty. But within that lonely cabin, a strange kind of life had begun. And yet, just beyond the hills, the soldiers were coming closer. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm, each one blending into the next like colors fading into dusk. The land stretched wide and endless around the Turner Ranch, dusty plains, golden grass swaying in the wind, and mountains standing silent in the distance like old gods watching from afar. It was a land built for solitude, and solitude had been Caleb Turner's only companion for years. Until now, inside his cabin, the presence of the Apache woman had changed everything. Her name was Nayeli, though Caleb still didn't know it. She moved softly, like a shadow in human form, her bare feet barely making a sound against the wooden floorboards. Each morning, when he rode out to the fields, she remained behind, tidying the cabin, mending what she could, and keeping the fire alive. She had stopped hiding in the wardrobe, but she still kept her distance, as if unsure whether she was a guest or a prisoner. The silence between them spoke more than words ever could. Caleb didn't ask who she was, or why she'd been hiding. He didn't press her with questions, nor demand that she leave. Something deep in him understood. This woman had survived things he couldn't imagine, and forcing her story from her lips would only wound her further. So he gave her space, time, and quiet kindness. It was in those wordless exchanges that something began to grow. In the soft light of dawn, she would watch from the window as he saddled his horse, his movements steady and sure. He carried himself like a man burdened by ghosts, yet his gentleness betrayed a heart still capable of warmth. In the evenings, when he returned, she would leave a bowl of stew by the table and slip to the far side of the room. He never commented on it, but she noticed how he always finished every bite. One afternoon, a stray wind carried the sound of horses from the ridge. Nayeli's blood ran cold. Through the slats of the window she saw two riders, soldiers in dust-covered coats, their rifles glinting under the sun. Caleb was in the corral, tightening a saddle strap. He noticed them too. Without hesitation, he gestured toward the cabin, his eyes sharp with warning. Nayeli vanished inside, heart hammering. She retreated to the cellar, slipping through the trapdoor beneath the rug. The space was dark and narrow, the air thick with earth and the faint scent of old grain. Above her, she could hear the muffled thud of boots as the soldiers arrived. Caleb's voice, low and calm, met theirs. She couldn't hear the words, but she could sense the tension. The soldiers were looking for survivors, her people. For nearly an hour, she remained hidden in the darkness, every sound a knife against her nerves. Then, at last, silence. The creak of boots faded, and the front door shut once more. Caleb lifted the trap door. Their eyes met. In that brief moment, something shifted. For the first time, Nayeli saw the look of protection in his gaze. Not pity, not fear, but the quiet resolve of a man who had chosen to keep her secret. Even at the risk of his own life, she felt a warmth stir within her chest, one that frightened her as much as it comforted her. The next morning she found him by the stables, working silently. In her hands she carried a piece of cloth, her old dress, torn and faded. She had repaired it during the night with what little thread she could find. She hung it near the door, a small gesture of thanks he would never hear spoken. From that day on they lived in an unspoken bond of trust. She began helping more, feeding the chickens, fetching water from the well, even brushing down the horses when he was out mending fences. Though they never shared words, their movements became a shared language. When he built the fire, she set the table. When he repaired the barn door, she stood nearby, handing him nails and wood. At night, the cabin filled with the soft glow of the fire. Sometimes, Nayeli would sit near the window, her thoughts drifting back to the life she had lost. The songs of her people, the smell of mesquite smoke, the laughter of her younger sister now gone. The memories hurt, but they also gave her strength. She began to notice small things about Caleb, how he hummed quietly while sharpening his knife, how he paused before touching the scar on his arm, how his eyes softened when he looked at the sunset. The loneliness that had once weighed heavy on him now seemed to ease, replaced by a fragile peace. He didn't quite understand. The first real moment of closeness came one evening when she was carrying water back from the well. The bucket was heavy, and her arms trembled from exhaustion. She stumbled on the uneven ground, spilling half of it. Before she could try again, Caleb appeared beside her, wordlessly taking the handle from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, just for a second. But the warmth of that touch stayed with her long after he had walked ahead. That night, when he came in from the fields, the cabin felt different. The silence wasn't the same kind of silence anymore. It was softer, filled with the sound of their shared breathing, the crackle of firewood, the subtle rhythm of two lives slowly weaving together. But peace, in the Wild West, was as fragile as glass. By the end of that week, Caleb rode into town for supplies. The air was heavy with tension when he returned. Nayeli saw it in his eyes before he even spoke. He didn't have to explain. Soldiers were still scouring the territory, growing desperate to root out the remaining Apache survivors. And worse, Samanon had mentioned seeing a woman near the Turner ranch. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire until dawn, rifle leaning against his knee, his gaze fixed on the door. Nayeli watched him quietly from the shadows, realizing with sudden clarity that he wasn't just protecting her out of duty or pity anymore. He was protecting her because he couldn't imagine losing her. And though she didn't yet have the courage to face what was forming between them, she knew that from this moment on their fates were no longer separate. The land beyond their walls held danger, and the days ahead promised no mercy. But for now, for just one more dawn, they were safe. In that fragile calm before the storm, a bond unspoken but unbreakable had taken root. The following week carried a tension so thick, it seemed to press against the very walls of the cabin. Each morning the rising sun brought with it an uneasy stillness. The wind no longer sang through the grass but whispered warnings across the plains. Even the horses grew restless, stamping their hooves and flicking their ears as if sensing what was to come. Caleb Turner rose before dawn every day now. His movements had grown sharper, more guarded, and his eyes scanned the horizon with the precision of a man who expected danger. The memory of that brief encounter with the soldiers had not left him. He knew men like that, relentless, hungry for orders, and quick to draw blood in the name of duty.